So, for example, what's happening between the right and the left in America, hundreds of millions of Americans are now taken over by the disease of tribalism 24/7. And they separate themselves according to the TV channels they see, etc. They don't realize they have been completely enslaved by political leaders. So the tribal identity has invaded their whole identity, and they became useful idiots.
Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Rabbi Rafi Mallet, everybody's Rebbe. I am extremely privileged to have with me today a very special individual, a scholarly individual, a sagacious individual, a holy individual. His name is Dr. Rene Levy from Seattle, Washington, where I used to live, a place that's very beloved to me, and his family is very beloved to me, and he is very beloved to me. And Dr. Levy is Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's the author of a number of books, including Baseless Hatred, What It Is and What You Can Do About It, Mending America's Political Divide, and very recently, Jewish Unity in an Age of Sinat Chinam. Sinat Chinam means baseless hatred. Jewish Unity in an Age of Baseless Hatred, a book that brings probably one of the most important ideas in Judaism, the importance of the Jewish people uniting in order to end that plague which caused our exile and suffering in the first place. And it's a beautiful book filled with tremendously important ideas. And Dr. Levy is here to speak with us. Dr. Levy, I would love for you to give an introduction of yourself, who you are, your background, and how you were led to undertake the writing of this incredible book.
I have been a professor at the University of Washington since 1970 and was active till 17 years ago. I created a department and I worked on the treatment of epilepsy. I'm a neuroscientist, a neuropharmacologist, and that's what brought me to the interest of how the brain functions. And 17 years ago, I had given a lecture on the topic of baseless hatred, and I was invited to a lecture tour based on that lecture. And my wife, who was with me, had noticed that people were deeply affected. So my wife asked me to retire from my job at the university to write that material, because our teacher, our rabbi, had told her that I did not own the information that was in it, and I had a duty to write it. So I listened to her advice, which was very difficult for me 17 years ago, and I began to work on the topic of two Hebrew words. One means hatred, and one means for no reason, baseless. And so this idea that there is such a thing as baseless hatred, what came out from the sages of the Jewish people. In the literature on hatred, we don't find it. If you search for baseless hatred, you don't find it, because no one believes there is such a thing. Okay.
Can I interrupt you for just a second? When you say the literature, can you specify what you mean by the literature?
The literature on hatred.
Which literature on hatred? Not Jewish literature on hatred, because we do have such a thing.
On the emotion of hatred. Okay. So
Do you mean in the world of like psychology and secular wisdom?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. In psychology, the people who wrote on hatred and did research on hatred are few and far between. But you find various qualifiers of hatred and many stories how it leads to genocides and all that. But the idea that hatred is or can be baseless is a uniquely Jewish idea, which we, the Jews, did not understand. I hate to say, for the last 1,900 years, because, like the rest of the world, we didn't realize that hatred is not one emotion. It's a complex syndrome that is situated at the intersection of several neuroscientific disciplines, not just psychology. And because we have no vocabulary for hatred, we, meaning the whole world, at least the English speaking world, we use the word hate to say, I hate spinach, I hate my teacher, and I hate the person who killed my father. How is it possible that you use the same word for all those things at once? So we use hatred for a dislike, simple dislike of some food, and we use hatred for criminals, for genocides. So that shows that we understand nothing. I'm saying the popular literature understand very little, and and you will not find scientific congresses, neuroscience congresses on the notion of hatred. There's a silence about it. Okay, and we have very simple notions.
So what I'm thinking as you're saying this is, you're talking about Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred, and I think it's a very confusing term because, if you say to a Jewish person, what does Sinat Chinam mean, and he says, well, it means baseless hatred. He said, but be more specific. So they'll say it means hatred between one Jew and another Jew, right? That's its most common usage. So how does, we talk about sinat chinam, hatred of one Jew to another. How does that really line up with the term baseless hatred? It doesn't, baseless hatred, like you're saying, means hatred for no reason. Well, maybe I have a reason for hating a fellow Jew. God forbid. But in other words, I don't think throughout history that we've suffered from the problem of sort of Jewish infighting that we ever thought it was for no reason. So maybe you have some insight into why we use the term baseless hatred and why does that mean why does it mean the meaning that we ascribe to it?
Okay. The words baseless hatred were invented by our sages after the Jews lost their independence and lost the Second Temple, but they did not explain what they meant. I'm sure they understood what we understand today and what I came to understand after 17 years of research is that most of hatred is baseless. Why? If we want to go back to what you're saying, two Jews or two persons, okay, it doesn't make a difference. What our sages warned us is that we have two parts in our brain. The part which is rational, the so-called advanced nervous system, but we have also a primitive neural system, okay, which is there to protect us from threats. It's very active. It perceives any potential threats, and it responds by triggering hatred. Hatred meaning creating a distance with that source, that potential source of hatred, of threat, and it eliminates our empathy. And what our sages are saying is saying, look, you cannot live in society if you do not overcome this overtaking of your brain by your primitive brain. Your primitive brain, the one organ is the amygdala, is there and was there always to signal to you that there's a threat. But for it to be effective, it had to be very sensitive. So if you're standing in a social environment, in a party, and you're holding your drink and you're speaking, and the person who passes the drinks trips and spills the drink on you, what your primitive brain makes you do is respond with hatred, meaning that inside of you, it tells you, I wish this person drops dead after finishing their job, because here it is, I'm at the beginning of the party, I have a new suit and I cannot change myself, and I'm going to live the whole evening with a wet suit, okay, because they were not careful, and I don't have to pay the price for that. So baseless hatred was there to alert us to the fact that each time our primitive brain, not us, our primitive brain perceives for us a potential threat, it triggers hatred. And hatred is a nuclear response because it makes you completely insensitive to other people. People who lose their empathy are extremely dangerous. We know, for example, that children who are born with a defect in their empathy system, and we know also some, serial criminals, okay, at the other end of the spectrum, that when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they could take a chicken, cut the head. They could take a mouse and cut the head. They could take a rat and cut their head, and not feel what we feel. When we go see a movie and we see blood flowing, and where we see a very sad scene, our empathy forces us to feel an emotion, and sometimes to cry or to stop seeing. We can't take it. Why? Because our empathy for other people stops us. But when you lose your empathy, you see other people as objects. You no longer see them as living beings. So to lose your empathy for another person who is an acquaintance or a friend or a neighbor is an unfair, excessive, immoral response 100% of the time. It's unacceptable in society.
So if I could paraphrase what you're saying,
that's what our sages wanted us to understand.
I think it's incredibly brilliant. I want to paraphrase what you're saying, and you tell me if I've understood. So one of the amazing insights in your book, which really blew my mind and just continues to keep my neurons firing to this very moment, is this contrast and this dichotomy that you just described of the advanced nervous system versus the primitive nervous system, the sort of higher level cognitive functions versus the lower, the the prefrontal cortex on the one hand, you have the amygdala on the other hand, which is sometimes called the primitive brain, the reptilian brain, the lizard brain, and that again, I think based on your research in the area of psychology, that emotions like hatred, they perhaps emerge from and pull us into that lower nervous system, that primitive nervous system, and basically eliminates our humanity, which is something like you're describing the elimination of empathy, which I think is something that the sages say in different words, like a person who gets angry, he's like an idolater. A person who gets angry is like, loses his mind, etc. So in other words, your point is, even if you think you have a reason to get angry, that emotion of anger strips you so much of your humanity that it doesn't belong. It's incongruent with the higher level neshama, the soul, the spiritual being that you are at your core, your neshama, that Hashem wants you to be. So by retreating into that primitive brain with the emotion of hatred, you're really moving away from what Hashem wants you to be. And so there's no rationale for that. There's no excuse for that. That is chinam. By definition, that is, so to speak, without reason. It's baseless because it's inexcusable, maybe you could say. Is that more or less?
No. I appreciate you rephrasing it because I'm at a loss when I teach, and I need people like you who have studied and can express it their way with their own, uh, uh, vision and understanding. But let me. Can I go one step further? You brought up anger. Let's for a minute, to understand what baseless hatred is, let's compare the emotion of hatred through an incident with anger. Okay? So here's the difference, it's humongous. No one can stay angry for 18 years. But our primitive neural system is so dangerous that as soon when you have gone through any kind of small insult, in my books I give the example of the mother-in-law that makes a comment to the daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law doesn't forget it for decades. When people have been insulted, when brothers and sisters don't speak to each other, it can last 1 year, it can last 18 years, it can last until death. That doesn't happen with anger. Sure, people are angry and they can, pull their gun in road rage and kill somebody, but they don't continue to do that. Hatred lasts indefinitely. It's almost irreversible. There's no common measure between both. And that's why everything our sages say, for example, that being angry is like idol worshiping. Multiply that by the largest number you can think of, and you get hatred, and you get that degree of idol worship. That's what hatred is.
Okay, I love what you said, and you really clarified that for me. Like you just took it to a whole new level for me, more than even I came away from your book, because that clarification was so helpful. And now, if you'll allow me, I want to just sort of mirror back to you what I heard in my own words, and tell me if I'm understanding it, because it really strikes me very strongly. What I said was that because I moved from hatred to anger, right? So that I said anger pulls you into your lower brain. And you said, yeah, but that's a short-lived experience. That's a short-lived emotion. Hatred is lingering. Hatred lasts for potentially forever, like you said, decades. or potentially forever. But it's, again, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like what I said was that the anger pulls you down into your primitive brain and takes away your humanity. But you said something much deeper. You know what? You know what the hatred does? Even though it's sort of, maybe, if I'm saying this correctly, maybe it originates in that primitive fight or flight lower nervous system, but then it infects the higher nervous system. It pulls itself and it takes over the top. And then you start rationalizing all kinds of reasons why you're right to hate that person. You intellectualize something that is deep and emotional, animalistic, and not part of our humanity, not part of that empathetic self, that soul being. And then it takes over up here and it goes, no, this person deserves all these feelings I have toward them because this, and then, and it persists. So beyond just pulling you out of here, the hatred goes and it infects us up here. It's even more insidious than anger. Is that a good description?
Yes, and here's why. We have to bring in two other notions to solidify what you said and to congeal it. Okay. One is our primitive brain makes us feel as a victim, and victimhood in the Jewish tradition, okay, is not accepted. Okay. Viktor Frankl, it took him, he transformed psychiatry with the idea that you're not a victim. You can choose the time and the manner of your response. No one can take that away from you, okay, through his experience in the Holocaust. So our primitive brain makes us feel victim, and it makes us feel victim of an injustice. That's the other notion. One is victimhood, and the other is the injustice. And human beings are extremely sensitive to injustice. We have, parts of our brain that drive you bonkers about injustice. And 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 in the Jewish tradition, we have many, many sources that tell you exactly the same thing. For example, we have in the book of Genesis, in a dialogue between God and Abraham, God speaking to himself, it appears, saying, will I hide, in Hebrew, will I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? By that, he was referring to, he was going to destroy the two cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, actually 5 cities. Okay. And God asks the question, and when we read that, we don't know why that happens. We don't think God is asking us our opinion, but it's there to emphasize that God decided to tell Abraham that something came up, a a lot of injustice from those cities, and God was going to come down and execute judgment. As soon as Abraham hears that, he responds, will the judge of the earth not do justice? And we shrug our shoulders and say, but Abraham, our forefather, 2 minutes ago, you didn't know what God was going to do until he revealed it to you. How, and you have no other information. How can you accuse God of potential injustice? Based on what? Answer, That dialogue was there for God to show to us, the descendants of Abraham, that Abraham loved humanity so much that he did not accept the punishment and the destruction, and he was hoping that somewhere, somehow, he was going to convince God not to do it. So the sense of justice and injustice is very strong in us, and that's why then the argument starts. Maybe there are 50 righteous or 10 righteous people who can help those people who committed those injustices. The whole discussion about that. Same thing in our prayers. I don't want to get into detail of the so-called Shmoneh Esrei, the 18 benedictions, which are 19. Immediately after the Jews are reassembled, the great barrier is setting up tribunals and judges who are honest. And same thing when Moses' father-in-law came to visit him. Okay, he asked him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm judging the people." They absolutely, but he says, "You're going to run out of energy." Moshe was ready to run out of energy to provide justice. So our primitive brain, what it does to us is says, when you're at a dinner and a family member makes silly jokes about you, when you go home and you drive with your wife or your husband, you feel that you were attacked unjustly. That makes it impossible for you to forgive, and that makes you prisoner to keeping a grudge towards that person as long as you live.
I wanna, based on what you just said now, you gave me a couple of ideas. There was one idea that I came away from the book. Now, I'll be honest, I can't remember if you said this explicitly in the book or if what you said in the book made me think this, but you were talking. Let's see if I can develop this idea. You were talking about, again, the advanced nervous system, the primitive nervous system, the so-called reptile brain, and what they call the lizard brain, the primitive brain. And I was and how these sort of lower emotions uh come from there. And envy and jealousy and hatred and anger and so forth. And I was thinking about how these kinds of pitfalls of baseless hatred and the other types of hatred that you talk about in the book, and the other types of strife and discord that the Torah forbids and that we fall into through the traps of the Yetzer haRa, through the traps of the evil inclination, and how the evil inclination is described in the Torah as a snake, a serpent, or a reptile. And I was wondering if there's a connection, that the Torah is making a connection between the, so to speak, reptilian brain, the reptilian nervous system, versus the advanced nervous system is almost like Yetzer haRa, Yetzer Tov. The evil inclination, which is the snake-like, lizard-like reptilian part of us, versus the Yetzer Tov, the higher inclination, the more spiritual, intellectual part of us. But what you that I remember thinking reading the book. I don't know if you said it in the book or not. Maybe you have some thoughts about it. But the what you said now about the sense of justice, and how that sense of justice is what drives us to hold on to feelings of resentment and hatred. I think also of the Middat ha Rachamim versus the Middat haDin, the attribute of mercy versus the attribute of justice. That is it also these kind of dueling attributes within our personalities that also kind of parallel the upper and lower uh, cognitive nervous system, the advanced and the primitive? Is there a connection there with these spiritual concepts? What do you think?
We can build them, but I go very close to doing that in the book, but very carefully I shy away from that. Why? Because I'm not an ordained rabbi. I'm just, I spend a lot of years in my life learning the Judaism,
Well,
but
your
I'm not.
book is full, is rife, is replete with Torah sources and wisdom from great sages as far back as, the Tanakh itself, the Talmudic sages up to current present time. So you're a very learned, scholarly person in the area of Torah wisdom.
No, but I'm sorry. I appreciate that, but in our system, in our tradition, okay, it's called illegal practice of medicine, meaning that you could be a PA who has worked 40 years, in an office with doctors, and you know a lot about medicine and a lot of correct information. And so you set up shop and you start to see patients and treat, assuming you can write prescriptions, whatever. Okay. And give advice. And so I I I accepted from day one when uh, I began, learning as an adult. And for example, when I was in Seattle, I never gave a lecture or anything like or wrote unless I had it read by an ordained rabbi. In my case, it was Rabbi Maimon, who, thank God, lived till 100, so I could learn with him for 50 years. Okay, and and that's how I got into this business, because when I wrote my first lecture on Sinat Chinam, and I submitted it to him, he said, I don't want you to give this lecture. I want you to wait till the synagogue is going to celebrate my 90th birthday, and I want you to speak there, and I want my son Michael to speak there. I want both of you to speak. So I gave that lecture at that time. And then Rabbi Maimon thought there were so many important things that he literally harassed me to sit down and write it, telling me, you don't own this information. It's not yours. Okay, you have to make it public. And that's how I, through the influence of my wife, he was not able to influence me, but he was able to influence my wife. And she was able to influence me, and that's how I got into this. So the closest I got to what you are saying, Rabbi, is that I wrote the following thing. I wrote that the Yetzer haRa, the evil inclination, harnesses the primitive neural system. Those words I wrote, I remember. Okay, and so they work together. Okay, and that's as close as I will get to it, unless I could sit down with a big, with a very learned rabbi who would give a stamp and say that that's the Yetzer hara. I'm not authorized to do that.
I appreciate your honesty and your candor and your humility. So I'm glad that you remembered what you wrote in the book, because I do remember coming away from the book with that idea, but not remembering if it was explicit. So I think I got your message, even though you didn't say it outright because of your humility. But it definitely reminds me of how Chazal say, our sages say that the the Yetzer haRa, the evil inclination, or that angel that represents that power, says that he took control of the snake. Like the snake was a creature in the Garden of Eden, and it was like an animal, and the Yetzer haRa says he rode him like, kind of like a rider would ride a steed, that the Yetzer hara, like, rode him. So I think maybe based on those words, he was saying that the Yetzer hara, the evil inclination, harnesses the primitive nervous system. And I was thinking of this. The snake was, it says Chazal, our sages say, the evil inclination harnessed the snake as almost like an avatar to carry out his wicked plan. Um, anyway, I think it's a brilliant idea. I want to emphasize for my audience just really how brilliant the book is, and just how much is it's a little book. It's a small soft cover book. It's an easy read, but it's just filled with so much incredible information, from Torah sources and psychology sources. I hope my power doesn't go out. My lights just flickered. Um, and there's some of the things you discuss in there are, for example, I'll just throw out two things that I don't necessarily want to dwell on unless you do, and I'd love to hear if you want to elaborate. But I want to also progress to some other themes. People have a misconception that, like, sinat chinam, this idea of hatred between one person and another, falls exclusively into the category of commandments between one man and his fellow man. Like, we have two categories of commandments: commandments between man and God, and commandments between man and his fellow man. And people tend to think that this issue of my dislike, hatred, bearing a grudge, whatever it might be, towards another person is purely in one domain and does not affect my relationship with God. And one of the points that you make in the book is to dispel that myth that there is very much a bein adam lamakom, a between man and God aspect of the relationship between one man and another, that a person can't think that he's cool with God, he's just fine with God, his problem is just with this other person. Really, if you want to be right with God, you need to also be right with your fellow human being. That was one idea. Another idea was, um yeah, so Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement atones for sins between man and God, but does not atone for sins between man and his fellow man until he goes and makes right with his fellow person. So the reason I bring up these points is just some of the things that people take for granted, maybe not thinking so much about the degree to which this issue of strife between one person and his fellow is really so detrimental to them on so many levels. That, number one, it destroys their relationship with God, and also that there's no atonement for it. And but aside from the issue of personal personal strife between individuals, you talk about group sinat chinam, the hatred between groups and tribalism, and again, that's another aspect of the primitive nervous system that we're hardwired. Our brains are hardwired that within a fraction of a second, when we encounter another individual, our brain measures, is he one of us or not? Is he on my team or is he not on my team? And it's a threat assessment, and we're without even thinking about it, totally unconsciously or subconsciously, we are categorizing people and dividing people into different groups, and this leads to group hatred. Now, in the Torah, there are 12 tribes of Israel. God did divide us into groups. And part of the beauty there is God is saying a person doesn't have to be in the same group as you for you to love them, have respect for them, embrace them. and be united with them. So the Torah is saying, yeah, there are divisions, and that is part of your hardwiring, but that's okay. You can be different and you can still have love for one another. And yet we see today, not only within Jewish society, but within the larger society, there's a tremendous amount of factionalism, political factionalism, um, racial division to a degree and at a temperature I've never seen before in my lifetime. And I know that I mentioned in the beginning that you have a book on sort of the political divide, and all those books kind of converge on this topic. But certainly when I was reading this book on Jewish unity, and I didn't know about your other books, I was thinking, this is so relevant to not just the Jewish people, but what's going on in the world at large. And I wondered if you wanted to comment about some of the broader applications of the ideas in your book to groups and to society, and how we can improve the way the world is today.
You brought up two fundamental points. Your 2 points. They're fundamental. They need time. So what I will do, if you tell me how much time you have, I'll try to deal with. I'll divide it between those two because I want to deal with both of them because they're both extremely important. They're like the core of the book, and so and I'm delighted to see what you've taken out of the book, uh,
Right.
because
Well, I know that you can't this is part of what I'm trying to express to my audience is there's so much in the book that, there's no way to boil the book down into a soundbite in this interview. But if there are certain ideas that you could in 5 to 10 minutes
yeah, okay,
highlight from the book to give people an example of the type of wisdom that you've shared that can help them on an individual level and can help us as a people and help us as a society, maybe highlight some part of that that you think you could express, and it'll be a taste, it'll be an enticement for those listening now to get a hold of the book. And by the way, I'll put links to in the video description for people who want to be able to purchase the book. And I also want to give you a chance to talk about um, how you have been traveling and conducting seminars for communities to help people in a hands-on way to implement and apply the principles in the book. But we'll get to that after. So if you want to take 5 to 10 minutes to um, highlight something on the topic of the question that I asked.
okay. You asked two questions. The first one was the what I call the vertical dimension of an issue between two people. One person insulted the other, and so the other keeps a grudge towards the one person, and and they keep it in their mind. Once you keep a grudge, it owns you, and you think that it's only a private issue between you and your neighbor, for example, and it has nothing to do with all your religious life. It's just a mishap in your life. You happen to have a bad neighbor. So uh, the I want to tell all the members of your audience who are Jewish and are considering what to do between now and Yom Kippur that it is very important for them between now and the 8th of the month of Tishri, that is a day before Yom Kippur, okay, to realize that what the Torah expects of us is not to stop the eruption of hatred because it is subconscious. The Torah doesn't hold us responsible for things that are subconscious. That's one of that the rabbis consider the chidushim of this book. but it holds us responsible for harboring it willingly and not doing anything about it. So, but what's essential is they have to know that because the hatred is so called in the heart, according to the language in the Torah, okay, only you and God really know what's involved. So it's completely between in your relationship, and all you have to do is before Yom Kippur to decide in for the sake of the integrity of your relationship with God to forgive that person in your heart, because all the hatred you have fabricated in the heart is a huge multiplier, is completely unfair, unjust compared to what that person did. Because we are taught, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, meaning you don't pay back somebody 1,000 times. You don't shoot them because they passed you on the freeway. Okay. But we're able to do that. And so one piece of advice is, yes, there's a very strong dimension of what we call Ben Adam LaMakom between us and God in this domain, and we can't take care of it before Yom Kippur, because if we do not, we expose ourselves on Yom Kippur to ask God to forgive us in our so-called sins between us and God, while the day before we refuse to forgive another person of his children. So it causes it makes us in very bad situation on Yom Kippur. I let the rabbis decide what that is, but for me, it means my Yom Kippur is not useful at all if I cannot forgive. How can I ask for forgiveness? Okay, so that's for one issue. The other issue is the issue of political and religious tribalism in societies in general. And you even brought up a beautiful point that after the Jews became a people for the first time, where they became a free people, is when the Jews crossed the Red Sea and were on the other side. And they saw the Egyptians had died, and now they were free, they were not afraid. And now they had to walk in the desert initially for a year or two, and then it turned out to be 40 years. And God tells Moses to tell the Jews they have to walk according to the tribes which originated 210 years before through the marriage of their forefather Jacob, etc. And the question is, if it's the time to create a people, why divide them according to where they came from 210 years before? How does that help make a people? Answer is it is very difficult for a person to deal with their own identity and have to jump from that to the identity of a nation, to be a member of a nation. And what people do is what's called group belonging. People are social, and they have a human need which according to the scale of Maslow is situated very high to the top of belonging to groups. The danger of that is that groups compare themselves to each other, they compete, they become tribal, and they trigger hatred. And we have a neurocircuitry in the brain that involves several circuits, okay, that makes us so tribal that our tribalism takes over our identity as individuals. So, for example, what's happening between the right and the left in America is that citizens who before were just citizens and they voted for once every 4 years for a president, and after a few days later, life went on. Now these people, these citizens, hundreds of millions of Americans, okay, are now taken over by the disease of tribalism 24/7, and they separate themselves according to the TV channels they see, etc. They don't realize they have been completely enslaved by political leaders. So the tribal identity has invaded their whole identity, and they became useful idiots. I stop there.
Okay. Thank you for that. What do you think is the way that we can overcome that? Now, obviously, we cannot change the world. One person can't change the world. Sometimes we have to start with the man in the mirror. And, as a person, now I'm 45, I lived a few decades. I've gone through many stages of my own maturity. And, there were certainly times where I was more tribal, where I identified more strongly with one group and I felt, we're right and everyone else is wrong. And it took time for me to grow out of that and to grow up from that. And I try to spread messages like your message and anyone who listens to my channel, messages of love and acceptance, of being humble, of saying, it's okay to admit that you're wrong. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to accept someone else's opinion. What are practical ways for individuals to either help themselves to overcome these big issues that we've just described, or to help others or their communities or society at large? Maybe he can't do all those things, but what is a positive step that you recommend?
First, making the decision, accepting that the diagnosis of the disease, that we are polarized, and make the decision we want to depolarize ourselves for our sake and the sake of our country and the sake of our families. So when we have a dinner together and we talk about politics, we don't we can do it in a civil way. Okay. First, we have to learn the difference between biases, stereotypes, and prejudices. Okay. Then we have to be aware that our tribal identity has taken us over and we're not comfortable with that. We have stop using echo chambers of just being with people who think like us. We have to learn emotional intelligence, meaning learning how to listen to others. Then we have to participate in what's called structured conversations, where you can practice radical listening. And then I'll read you very quickly a few pieces of advice. One, accept others without expecting them to change their views, because knowledgeable people can reach different conclusions from the same set of facts. Ask scientists. Okay? They disagree from the same
Not
set of
only
facts.
scientists, that's also the sages of the Torah. When we say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, you have two sages that disagree vociferously, and they use the same methodology to derive different conclusions in Torah. And we respect both opinions. We respect both opinions, and both are held in good standing within the community of sages and God-fearing Jews.
And may I add something?
Absolutely.
I want to suggest a hypothesis why we accept that. why our sages tell us that both opinions are correct. You know why? Because when you look at life, there are life situations that involve paradoxes and contradictions where two things seem to be in conflict, but they both contain part of the truth. Why? Because in life, truth is divided. It's not on one side only. Okay? So that's the wisdom, is to understand that. And the other pieces of advice is to release the expectation that you must persuade others to adopt your point of view, and to acknowledge the fact that there's a contradictory opinion, and you can acknowledge it without agreeing with it. You just say it stands, there are times in life where it is valid. And you can engage with a conflicting viewpoint without betraying yourself. You can, if you're on the right, you listen to somebody on the left, who recites all their points one after the other. So you engage with it. You're not betraying yourself. You still remain on the right. You're totally intoxicated with your tribalism. And also, the fact that you try sometimes to find a middle ground doesn't mean that you are fake or that you're not assertive. So all this is feasible and attainable. And that's why I wrote that book, is because somebody from Amazon who had read my first book suggested that I write that book on the divisiveness in America, because, as you said, the principles are exactly the same.
In these final moments, I'd like you to, if you could describe to the listeners and the viewers the type of work you're doing, visiting communities and conducting seminars to help people to apply these principles. If you could just talk a little bit about that, and I'll put links in the video description how people can contact you if they would like to invite you to their communities.
This year, my wife and I went 3 times to Israel because I had been contacted because of the work I'm doing and because of the tribalism that exists there, that has become a security threat for the state of Israel. So went there, and we launched an initiative a month and a half ago called a Women's Jewish Unity Initiative, where women will teach women, because in women there are social networks of women teachers who have large followings, and all we need is to provide this material to them. So I'm working on these connections. We have created a group, and we plan to create one in the United States. And many leaders, I'm not at liberty to mention some of them because they're presidents of countries, have asked me why women, and it's a long discussion. And I explained that women have the ability to connect and to have sisterhood and to deal with these ideas and transmit them and fashion the new generation. And it's a hope for the future. So for now, you're the only man I work with. It's you, Rabbi. But if you know, or your audience knows, of women who are interested in training, we have 2 tracks: one for just learners, women who want to learn, and one for women who want to become teachers. And those who want to become teachers, we teach them by Zoom. how to answer questions on this topic of hatred and especially baseless hatred, and how people can free themselves, become sovereign, improve their lives, and they're the ones who benefit. And that at the end, it's an act of selfishness. If you free yourself from baseless hatred, you're the first benefactor. So you should do it just if you love yourself enough.
Right. It is quite fascinating that you found that women are the best demographic to work with for this, to kind of be the leaders of this movement, because that really brings us full circle, that the destruction of the Jewish people, so to speak, the Second Temple and the exile, was caused by baseless hatred, Sinat Chinam, and we're waiting for a redemption. And our sages told us that it was because of righteous women that the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And there are many who say that, therefore, it will be in the merit of the righteous women that we'll be redeemed from the final exile. And maybe the solution to this poison, to this toxin of baseless hatred, is going to come through the righteous women. But of course, that doesn't mean that men cannot also, and should not also, and do not also need to improve in this area. And I thank you for the time you spent with us. I want to just say the name of your book again: Jewish Unity in an Age of Sinat Chinam, which means baseless hatred. And again, I'll provide links in the video description. I highly recommend the book. It's full of wisdom, both from the Torah and from the world of psychology. And I gained so much from the book, and I think anyone who does will. And please make the choice to get a hold of the book, read the book, and apply the book. You will bring the world one step closer to redemption. And one by one, we should merit to see Mashiach speedily in our days and the full redemption of the world very, very soon. Thank you, Dr. Levy, for being with me. And I know we went beyond the time we said, and thank you for your generosity. I'm going to wish you a good night, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to meet again soon. I'll be in Seattle for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Maybe we'll cross paths again.
Hope so. Look forward.